Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular installment is one of a group that I've prepared for my introductory course on literary theory. And here the topic will be psychoanalytic theory, specifically the metaphor of the mirror stage, a concept developed by the French thinker Jacques Lacan as a way to understand human identity and the construction of social subjectivity. It's a complex theory, and this will be an abbreviated account, but I'll be drawing on some other 20th century developments that I've discussed in other webcasts on topics like phenomenology, structuralism, and post-structuralism. I find it useful to think of Lacan's mirror stage as a kind of an elaboration of Sigmund Freud's Oedipal complex. So let me rehearse here an admittedly oversimplified account of Freud's Oedipal complex. Referring to the classical Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, and also possibly with Shakespeare's play Hamlet in mind, Freud focuses on the psychological development of the young boy, proposing that at the age of 5 or 6 years old, a young boy will begin to recognize that he does not have unmediated access to his primary caregiver. Freud will suggest that the boy has a deep-seated unconscious desire to sleep with his mother and to kill his father. Of course, this is never articulated consciously, and most young boys will pass through the critical moment, recognizing that one cannot have this woman for one's own, but if one goes to school, learns to read, to follow the rules, eventually the child will grow up, become a man, and can have a satisfying relationship with a woman who is just about like his mother. Of course, Freud's theories were imperfect, incomplete, and sexist, and have been subject to elaboration, adjustments, and critiques over the past century. But that basic framework concerning the critical passage from one's infancy through the threshold of a process that will lead to mature adulthood has some symbolic resonance. Lacan essentially rethinks that critical moment, allowing for it to be applied to both boys and girls, and seeing it as initiated at a very early stage of infancy, and in effect, not simply as the threshold of adult maturity, but as the entry of the human organism into the order of language, defining language in the broadest terms possible, in line with the structural linguistics of Saussure and of Levi-Strauss's elaboration of Saussure's structural linguistics in larger anthropological cultural terms. Furthermore, this critical moment for Lacan is not something that simply happens once or with a definite end point. It's a succession of critical moments that begins at birth and ends only in death. Lacan's great metaphor for this process is the mirror stage. I'll begin with Lacan's concept of the real. The real is not reality. It might be something like a perfect reality, except that such a reality would never be possible. It would be a state of nature in which the human organism would have everything it needs, would desire for nothing. If there is an experience approaching this real, this state of nature, it might be the condition of the fetus in the womb. But the infant will be born into an environment that is disorienting and quite imperfect. For Lacan, the baby is an organism characterized by random nerve firings, pulses, disorganized, and without a focus. Lacan noticed that typically, if a young baby happened to be placed before a mirror, the baby would become entranced by its own image. He theorized this state of fascination as the entry into the imaginary, from the real to the imaginary. Eventually, Lacan began to revise the mirror stage as a movement from the real to the symbolic order. The mirror becomes merely a metaphor. The whole world is the baby's mirror. Here's how it works. The baby sees itself in the mirror and is entranced by its own image. It waves its hand, the mirror waves back. The baby fixes on this image in the mirror and mistakes it for its own identity. Imagine that what I'm describing here as a wave of the hand reflected in the mirror is something like the baby crying. The baby will cry instinctively, and usually someone will come with a bottle, a blanket, a change of diaper, or a tender touch, and the baby will be consoled. The cry is like the baby waving its hand, and the response is like the mirror's reflection. After the baby cries 10 or 12 times and produces some reaction, the baby will begin to think that its crying caused the bottle to be brought. The baby will begin to think that it's in control. But this is a mistake. The people around the baby, the society that the baby was born into, are in control. Others have decided how to respond to the baby's cry. And if the response had not been loving and caring, or if there had been no response at all, the baby's subject formation would have gone differently or not at all. This mistaken perception or understanding, which the infant will identify as its authentic self, Lacan calls the ideal ego. The infant is mistaking the relationship between its body and its actions and its perception of the reflection of the body and the actions in the mirror. It's understanding that relationship as a unity, as its authentic self. In my video on the early 20th century philosopher Edmund Husserl's concept of phenomenology, I discussed how, for Husserl, the human consciousness never perceives an external object in its essence. What we are conscious of when we engage a thing or concept outside of our consciousness is a projection. We are projecting an ensemble of categorizations onto what we perceive. We know the external object from our perspective, and it's not objective. Furthermore, from the perspective of structural linguistics, we understand that we recognize an external object as a sign. A sign is an element in a linguistic system. Our understandings are always already framed as a language. And Lacan famously says, the unconscious is structured like a language. Another way to state this would be to say with the post-structural philosophy of Jacques Derrida that there is nothing outside of the text. As far as human consciousness is concerned, everything is textualized. Everything that we can be conscious of, and indeed also our unconscious, all is part of a network or a tissue of language. The real remains, of course, as a persistent trace or a ghostly presence, somewhere behind, underneath, or around the edges. There is a natural physical reality. This subject is associated with a physical body. But the real remains as a trace, a sort of ghostly presence underneath, behind, or around the edges of the symbolic order. It's always there, tantalizingly close, but the subject will never be able to grasp it. In effect, language, the mirror, becomes a wall or a barrier, blocking access to the real, to the state of nature, for the subject of language. If this particular understanding of subject formation and human experience sounds bleak and pessimistic to you, let me offer a different spin, coming from a book called The Anti-Oedipus by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. For Deleuze and Guattari, the subject's misrecognition of its relationship to the other for its authentic self produces what they call the human as desiring machine. Since we are constituted by this lack at the very foundation of our subject formation, we always feel some uneasiness, some dissatisfaction, but always throughout our lives, in some way or another, desiring the fulfillment of authentic being. We will never quite achieve this, but along the way we will have some glorious adventures. On that note, I'll conclude this webcast. But, as always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.